One other thing that he took away from his university and seminary training was friendships. This is kind of another little application along the way. He had some remarkably deep friendships. Andrew Bonar was the closest, and then Alexander Somerville. The circle went out a little wider, but those two especially were remarkable friends. They used to study together, pray together, sing together, evangelize together. And the reason this has to be mentioned is because we wouldn't know of him without those friends.
How does God use our formative years to shape us? In this episode of Light and Truth, John Piper examines how God changed the entire trajectory of Robert Murray McCheyne's life during his time at university. This talk was originally given at the Desiring God 2011 Conference for Pastors.
Now, God knew that McCheyne would die at age 29. That's his plan. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Nobody else does. He has taken out of Satan's hand the power of death, according to Hebrews 2:14. So God knew that by appointment, this beloved son would die at age 29, which may be why God ordained that his call to the ministry was simultaneous with his call to Christ. So, he enrolled in divinity school at the University of Edinburgh, November, after his brother's death in July. This is before he was born again, according to his own testimony. So November of 1831, he is now enrolled in the Divinity Hall at the University of Edinburgh. And like so many people, certainly me, he met in those days the man who would be the decisive theological experiential influence on his Christian life, namely Thomas Chalmers. I wonder how many of you could think back over your years of decisive moments where somebody came into your life and they just stamped you forever. That certainly was true for me in my seminary days, and it was true for McCheyne with Chalmers. Chalmers had been converted in 1811 while being a pastor in a moderate Church of Scotland church. After his conversion, he became the professor of moral philosophy at the University of St. Andrews in 1823, and then he moved down to Edinburgh in 1828, just about the same time that McCheyne is showing up. He was the human force, the main one, in revitalizing the Church of Scotland and overcoming the deadening effects of moderatism. He was warm-hearted, devotional, evangelistic, Calvinist, and he shaped McCheyne's life and ministry more than anyone else. You may have heard of the sermon, The Expulsive Power of a New Affection. That's my first exposure to Thomas Chalmers, was running into that in a collection of Reformation sermons that I read way back, I can't even remember when, 30, 40 years ago. As soon as I saw it, the expulsive power of a new affection, I knew I had a kindred spirit. That's all I'm about, is trying to awake affections that will exclude all the wrong kind. That's everything I want to do. And so there he was, that kind of Christian hedonist, Scottish style, is the way I would call it. It typified the practical, heartfelt urgency for holiness and urgency for the pastoral ministry that was built into McCheyne's life in his 4 years in theological training there under Chalmers. He passed along to McCheyne all this learning, and he put it in the service of holiness and evangelism. Two heartbeats of McCheyne is a passion for holiness and a soul winner to the end. In fact, one of the interesting things I don't include here anywhere, but there are about 3 quotes I found of McCheyne saying he didn't think he was cut out to be a pastor. He was a pastor all his life, and he said, I really believe I'm cut out for itinerant ministry. And he was doing these all over the place and frustrating his people, that he was just burdened for the lost. He got that from Chalmers. Chalmers was passionate for holiness and evangelism. He warned McCheyne and the students to watch out for the white devil and the black devil. The black devil meaning the fleshly sins of the world, and the white devil meaning the spiritual sins of self-righteousness. And he made the gospel of the crucified Christ the key, the central power for holiness. He was deeply burdened also about lostness. Not just holiness of the church, but the lostness of the people, and the people in Edinburgh in particularly, the poor in particular. So he founded a group called the Visiting Society. And he recruited McCheyne and the other young students to be a part of this society, and he sent them down into the areas of poverty in the city to both meet needs and proclaim the gospel because of how little gospel witness there was. And that sense of urgency for lost people gripped McCheyne powerfully. 2.5 years into his divinity studies, he made this first venture down into the city there. He'd been upper middle class, and now here is Chalmers sending him into the city, and this is what he wrote. Such scenes I never before dreamed of. Why am I such a stranger to the poor of my native town? I have passed their doors thousands of times. I have admired the huge black piles of buildings with their lofty chimneys breaking the sun's rays. Why have I never ventured within? How dwelleth the love of God in me? How cordial is the welcome even of the poorest and most loathsome to the voice of Christian sympathy. What embedded masses of human beings are huddled together, unvisited by friend or minister. No man careth for our souls is written over every forehead. Awake, my soul. Why should I give the hours and days any longer to the vain world when there is such a world of misery at the very door? Lord, put thine own strength in me. Confirm every good resolution. Forgive my past long life of uselessness and folly. You hear the birth of a new kind of passion within him as he ventures out into the lostness of the poor districts of Edinburgh. That would never leave him, and what motivated it all was his love affair of the rose of Sharon, and it was intensified increasingly by his thorn of suffering. One other thing that he took away from his university and seminary training was friendships. This is kind of another little application along the way. He had some remarkably deep friendships. Andrew Bonar was the closest, and then Alexander Somerville. The circle went out a little wider, but those two especially were remarkable friends. They used to study together, pray together, sing together, evangelize together. And the reason this has to be mentioned is because we wouldn't know of him without those friends. Without an Andrew Bonar, we would have never heard of McCheyne. He was just a pastor for 7 years, happened to be very intense, God-centered, wonderfully evangelistic, but probably not any different than several hundred others like that you've never heard of, maybe thousands of others like that you've never heard of. A friend captured it and put it down. It seems to me that these friends were something more than usual. They seemed to have intensified everything for each other. It's as though the spiritual effect of an experience on the three of them was more than the sum of 1 + 1 + 1. It seems that the effect of experiencing things together was exponential. As though a bolt of electricity vertically into one of them was like supercharged as it went out through three of them to others. So here's the way Bonar described this. I sometimes think that we three at that time were like the three disciples you read of, Peter, James, and John, before the day of Pentecost. Christ took these three into the chamber of Jairus' daughter and taught them how to raise the dead. He taught us from the very first to put no stress upon human appliances, but to keep to the gospel word. He took us to the Transfiguration Hill and showed us His person from time to time. He taught us to delight in His person and to behold in a glass the glory of the Lord and be changed into the same image. He took us to Gethsemane at communion times and showed us the cup that the Father gave Him to drink, in which He drank, leaving no dregs behind. For the last 5 years of McCheyne's ministry, Bonar ministered at Colas, just a few miles away, so that he had this very close friend very near at hand all the time. And when he died, the church at Dundee did exactly what you would expect. They turned to his closest friend and had him preach the next Sunday 2 times from Romans 8. You might ask yourself, who would you want your wife to turn to preach next Sunday if you drop dead on the way home? Is there anybody that's just so obvious, or 2 or 3 that are just so obvious she wouldn't even have a doubt? I'm going to go to this friend. One of my prayers, here's a little application. One of my prayers in these days of theological reformation and church revitalization in our day, that I think thousands of young pastors are experiencing, is that you would find, old or young, this kind of camaraderie. I am jealous for you, really jealous, to find this. It was so rare 30 years ago when I was starting. I came to Bethlehem in 1980. So in 1980, as I felt just bursting in me what I mean by Christian hedonism, which is kind of happy Reformed theology with an unreached people's orientation and an intensity of authentic worship orientation and a pietistic read your Bible and pray a lot orientation and a knock on doors, reach out and try to win people to Jesus orientation and a wartime lifestyle orientation and a totally 7-point Calvinism orientation. I looked for friends and you know, I mean, this is, if you're younger, you just can't realize there weren't any conferences like this. There weren't any. And now they're everywhere. They're everywhere. And there's a deep, deep ethos, theological commonality with a lot of diversity, but just a deep thing. And I'm just jealous you don't waste that. Find each other. Link arms. Dream a dream. Because we had this first conference in 1988 because I wanted some more friends. I mean, I had a cluster around me at the church. You know, Tom was there and Dave was nearby, and 80 guys showed up. 80 guys showed up in our chapel over at the church, and good old J.I. Packer, he loved to get things started. And now, all over the country, you can find each other. And don't take it for granted. McCheyne's power was intensified by the camaraderie, theologically, spiritually, ministerially, that he enjoyed with Andrew Bonar and Alexander Somerville. Your impact in the world, small as you may think it is, it isn't, will be exponentially increased through these kinds of friendships. Here's the way Van Valen described that McCheyne school, the cluster of people that were around his intensity. McCheyne's school tended to be more spiritual than theological. Their influence was evident not so much in the college halls or study rooms of the theological students. They distinguished themselves not in controversy when it concerned the fight against error, but rather their contribution was more effective in spreading the classical teaching on grace to the general public. Their task was especially focused on evangelization and revivals and didn't exist to give substance to theological structures, but hence their strength lay in their preaching, which distinguished itself from the preaching of others, quote, in the demonstration of the Spirit and power. So bands of brothers, comrades in a great cause, are more than the sum of their parts. May God link your arms theologically, spiritually, personally for the sake of that exponential effect. The last day of McCheyne's divinity lectures was March 29, 1835. He died in 43, remember, so just keep kind of the shortness of the timeline. He's finishing divinity school in 1835. He was just shy of being 22 years old, and that fall, he was called as the assistant minister to the double parish of Larbert and Dunipace, November 1835. He served there 1 year under a John Bonar, and then St. Peter's of Dundee called him, August 1836, next year, and there he went, and there he died 6 years later, 6.5. That's the sum of his life. There wasn't much to tell. If you look for extraordinary things, there probably were two unusual things. One, he made an 8-month trip to Israel because he wanted to find out how it was going with the ancient covenant people who were so rebellious, branches cut off from the vine, and how might God be moving in Israel, because that would be a sign of the great revival that's coming if God would be moving. So he's gone for 8 months, and while he was gone, the second amazing thing happened. Somebody else experiences revival in his own church, and then he comes back, moves into that revived moment where he got prayer meetings of 900 people every night, and it's in a revived mode to the rest of his life. Not the same intensity, but he enjoyed a remarkable season. But as far as, extraordinary, outstanding things besides those two, it was a pretty ordinary life. So what I've tried to do is think through, okay, what is it about this life that makes us think about him? Why do we read his sermons, and why are people doing biographies about him like this 168 years after his death? And now I'm back at my title, The Rose and the Thorn. He loved Jesus Christ, cherished the rose, and he was increasingly aware that he had a thorn in his lungs that was probably going to take him out early. I think that these two things, the shortness of his life, the presence of eternity, the pain that he was suffering increasingly with the cough that he had, and his love for Christ that was so intense, came to us through his words. My guess is in this room, of those of you who could quote something from him before this talk, would probably be hard put to recall any event from his life. Just his words. And so I think the key to his being useful today is what he said, not what he did. Except insofar as a life of intensity and authenticity has to be there under the words, otherwise they're empty. But if you just have a life of intensity and authenticity and you don't have anything remembered about what you said, nobody's going to know anything about your life. And so what's mediated to us today is through his words. So I want to move this thing toward an end by listening to him on these two big issues of holiness and communion with the rose, holiness of life, these things that were so important to him. I want his words to carry the day from here on out, since the events are not that unusual. I'm not going to focus on his preaching, but in passing, I want us to note that what gave his preaching its power, and it did have power, is these two things: a passion for holiness and a passion for Jesus in communion with Christ through the Word and prayer. Isabella Dickinson was going to marry Andrew Bonar. She heard him preach before she was converted, and this is what she said. There was something singularly attractive about Mr. McCheyne's holiness. It was not his matter nor his manner either that struck me. It was just the living epistle of Christ, a picture so lovely, I felt I would have given all the world to be as he was, but knew all the time I was dead in sins. So the man himself, for her anyway, was the sermon. It's what God made of him in private that made him so powerful in public. People sensed that. Like Moses coming down from the mountain and his face still shone. Nobody saw what happened on the mountain. They just saw this man's been on the mountain with God. That's evidently the effect it had on Isabella when she looked at him. The man himself was the sermon. God made him something remarkable in private. One who heard him preach said, "What a joy it is to come under the quickening and refreshing influence of a living creature, a true man of God, whose face, like the face of Moses, shines as if fresh from the holy mount." I think the reason he could commend Christ and the gospel with that kind of power is because the things of Christ were becoming increasingly precious to him. The rose was smelling sweeter all the time and looking more crimson beautiful as he moved towards his final thorn piercing.
This is Light and Truth, God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. Thank you for listening. On our next episode, John Piper concludes our three-part series on Robert Murray McCheyne with a message titled 10 Looks at Christ. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.